the dress changes. So that's, I had been, and then, we made a call out for people who were interested in either presenting or knew of people who were presenting for our meetings. And so Judy had done a meeting in Ellsworth that I knew about around Paris. And so I said, Judy, how would you come to Belfast? And she is going home to Vermont, what, in 3 days? So, well, so we just barely have Judy in person for today.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to be here because I have been doing this research for almost 2 years.
In front of you.
Thanks to the pandemic. And I'm an old genealogist. Every one of my ancestors, I don't have any Basques. You know, I have nobody but people who founded Newbury, Mass, and Topsfield, and Kittery.
Okay.
Okay, that section.
That were really.
And so for the last probably 15 years, I've gone off on these down these rabbit holes. One is a story about a fabulous philanthropist, a young German immigrant during the war. I just find there are interesting rabbit holes to go down. So anyhow, but this story is, and I'm going to stick to my slideshow because I will go down rabbit holes if I don't. All right. This is a story about finding a Black man, Pomp Russell. And it's the story of how an enslaved Black infant becomes a soldier and a citizen of the very, very tiny town of Weld, Maine. Has anybody ever been to Weld? Why?
My maiden name is Littlefield.
Oh my God,
And they found
can't
Weld.
fit that story. And why for you?
Well near Mount Blue,
It certainly is. Tumble down.
that's why.
Okay. Well, Farmington is just it's the county seat. Okay, it's pretty close by. And Ralph and I have lived there probably a little over 50 years. But my job has always taken me all over creation. Now that I prefaced that, you didn't really need to hear it. What I want you to know is this is a story about the roots of Weld and Maine's beginnings. And it's also about the branches of Weld's earliest families. And the third thing it is about for genealogical groups is how I got there, what process I used, because it had to be different. All right. So I'm going to show us probably 8 or 10 maps. And if you need to sit closer to see them, please feel free to move up. While we're in Belfast, we're really talking about Weld and Farmington. This is an early map. It's a 1677 map of all the land that Massachusetts owned. It just strikes me as so intriguing. And we are going to focus on Andover, Mass. We're going to go over the Merrimack River into New Hampshire, and we're going to end up in this area above where it says the province of Maine. Because even though Pomp was born in 1761, when I started doing this research, I found I had to go back to the 1650s. Okay, and this was a gift. This is a map that came early on in my research, and in a minute I'll tell you how I came to the story, but I want to ground you in location first. It centered Pomp Russell's story for me in Weld. It is an 1803 map, and it is of what is called Township number 5, which is now known as Weld, Maine. And a copy of this, if you want to see it and get up close, is now at the Osha Library. But this is in the hands of a family member who owned land from that part of Maine all the way to the Canadian border, the Stowells. Okay. Okay, so finding Pomp Russell. There's Pomp Stone. And it is a New Hampshire Revolutionary War stone in the middle of Maine. Did you even know it existed? Have you ever heard any of these Pomp Russell stories? You people who know Maine. Well, there is a lot out on the internet now, and a whole chunk of it's incorrect. But it's up there, so it's floating in them. And you will see a DAR marker, and I'll get to that in a while, just skim it. Those of you who know Weld know there are a lot of dirt roads. And this is way up on Center Hill, so as you drive into town from Wilton, you just take a right and you go way up by the state park, that vista, that amazing view. And you keep going and go around Center Hill. That's Center Hill. And this is the Masterman Webster Cemetery. And that stone, there's Pomp Stone and the flag. And what started this is, I was reckoning with my white privilege. It's as simple as that. And one of the easiest ways for genealogists to do that is to pay attention to our past. And what I found is this is the beginning of a New England story, and I didn't know it would be that. Pomp Russell was an enslaved Black infant. He became a free man, and eventually, and he lived from 44 to almost age 80 in Weld, Maine, when Weld was barely being settled. And it really has ended up, what I thought was a tiny nugget of a story to help a friend. It's ended up being 200 years of history, and it's genealogical history. And the woman in that photo is an English woman by way of Canada who happened to be the minister of the old meeting house in East Montpelier, Vermont, who said to a whole pile of us, anybody want to do any reading around dealing with our white privilege, given that we believe Black Lives Matter? And 150 of us said yes. And we met in small groups. And those small groups started February 2 years ago. And my group is still intact. I was meeting with them just last night. And we're doing some heavy duty reading and actions. Anyhow, so today, this gives you a sense of Franklin County. All right, whoops. We'll go to that map in just a second. You should be able to see Weld right here. See the lake, Webb Lake? And Wilton is here, Farmington is here, and all around Weld is Temple, Avon, Phillips, still Township number 6, Byron, Roxbury, Carthage. This was a find. When I found this map, I was overjoyed. It's a 1793 plantations map of Massachusetts lands. This is in, I think I got it from the Massachusetts Historical Society. And on that map, I can see that it was surveyed by Stephen Titcomb. In Farmington, the Titcomb, you'll hear 2 Farmington names, Titcomb and Abbott, and they are huge. And I want to know what the Abbott connection, why this room is called the Abbott room at some point. But you can see, here is Webb Lake, and all of that land includes the 6 townships that were eventually named Temple, Avon, Phillips, Carthage, originally Abbott's purchase, and Weld, which was called Plantation Number 5. And north of Weld, which was called, is still called Number 6. There are 194,360 acres on that map. And this was utterly unsettled land. It was the land of our ancestors, the Native Americans. So I'm going to cut to the chase. Pomp Russell, descendants. I'm on Ancestry. I'm on 23andMe. I have looked high and low. I am on all kinds of blogs. I have yet to find any direct DNA related descendant of Pomp Russell and his wife, Margaret Cobb, both Black people in the middle of New Hampshire. To actually a couple of different states. But today what you're going to learn is the story of one Russell related family, one Russell family Weld related descendant who cared enough to hold Pomp's story up to the light. And that person was in our book. And I will introduce her to you 2 slides from now. Talk about going down the rabbit hole. It's the pandemic. We are dealing with Black Lives Matter in our book group, and I'm on the internet because it's fun. All right, and I stumble across something I never knew existed. The American Anti-Slavery Almanac. It was from the year 1836. It was actually for the year 1836. So it was published in 1834. Has anyone ever seen this document? I never knew it existed. I have shown and talked with people all over. They never knew about it. It looks like our Farmer's Almanac. It has fabulous, just fabulous woodcuts. The inside of it has all kinds of stories, recipes, weather predictions, just like our Farmer's Almanac. And have any of you used archive.org? It's a wonder, isn't it? It's just an absolute wonder. I found it on archive.org, and that allowed me to simply scan. I could have searched something out, but this was a surprise to me. I just thought it would be fun to look into it. So I started scanning the pages, and I find 2 double-page spreads in the tiniest type you can possibly imagine, listing towns alphabetically over those 4 pages. And what they were listing were the earliest anti-slavery societies in the country. Well, I looked at that list and I thought, oh, I have nothing better to do. I'll transcribe that list by state. And as I'm plunking in names, or names of towns, I find Farmington. And what it did is it listed the chapter and it identified the president and the secretary of every group. Now, the anti-slavery societies never started till late November, December 1833. These are really early. This is 1834. And I find Farmington or Weld, Maine, and I'm going, really? Because these were very young towns. That the Weld map that I showed you was 1793, and it wasn't a town. It was a bunch of land. Well, I saw the names of the president and the secretary, and I knew 2 of those names. I didn't know the other 2. President of the Farmington group was a man named Isaac Rogers. He was the first congregational minister in Farmington. And when I looked him up, I found he had this huge life in Farmington as their minister, like forever, till he was ready to retire. Before that, he was part of the Maine Missionary Society, and they sent him to Weld Okay?
Yeah.
And I saw John Titcomb. Well, you'll remember the surveyor of that earlier map was Stephen Titcomb. And Stephen is considered the first settler of Farmington, or one of the very first. And Stephen's son, John, is now the secretary of that group. And in Weld, I find a man named Lafayette Perkins and Secretary Jacob Abbott. I look up Lafayette Perkins because I know the Abbott name. And I find out Lafayette Perkins is the first doctor in Weld. And you'll find out more about him in a minute. And well, the secretary, if you know Farmington at all, the Abbott School is incredibly famous. The Abbotts were known to be a family who truly deeply valued education. All right. And what I eventually found out is this secretary, you'll see that little 2 there, it's Jacob Abbott 2. I found out there's Jacob Abbott 1, 2, and 3, and I had to sort them out. Well, I got to my book group that afternoon, and the first thing we do is it's pandemic. We kind of touch base with each other. Okay, how are you doing? How are you coping? All right. I go, I found the coolest thing. Let me tell you about the Anti-Slavery Society in the middle of Maine. And this woman says to me, Judy, where in God's name are you from in Maine? Because they only know me as a Vermont person. Okay. And I said, oh, you've never heard of it. It's not the coast. She says, where are you from? I said, Farmington. She said, I was born in the Farmington Hospital. I said, Sally, who are you anyway? And she said, her name is Sally Giddings Smith. She is George Bass's great-great-granddaughter. Bass shoes, Bass shoes. Okay. And then there was this huge long pause. And she told us the story I'm going to tell you. And even as I say that out loud, I still get chills, because when she told us her story, Sally's 76. Sally, I was talking with her last night. She said, I can't wait to hear how the Belfast group goes. She said, I've lived with this story since I was an adolescent. And she said, I don't tell this story because I've never figured out what to do with it. But I know that there is someone buried up on Center Hill who was enslaved as an infant. He's a Black man. I don't quite know where, but I know he's not in the Center Hill Cemetery. And she said, nobody ever talked about it. My great-great-great Seth Bass married into the Russell family. And remember, it's Pomp Russell. Okay, and so I thought, when the book group is done, I'll just get on the internet and see if I can find anything that I can then pick up the phone and call Sally and say, I found out a little bit more. Well, I now know 200 years more. Here's Sally's story. A white mother, I now know to be Bethia Holt Russell, was bereft at the loss of her firstborn. Her firstborn was born April 25th, 1761. She said all she knew was that that white mother was so bereft that her husband got on his horse and rode to Charlestown to find a Black infant to assuage her grief. You can see why we all kind of stopped cold when we heard that story. I now know that they are Bethia Holt Russell and Thomas Russell. And the reality is this Black infant was taken from the arms of his mother, a Black enslaved woman, to assuage Bethia's grief and to meet the possible nursing assumptions of a white mother. And I got challenged when I did the Ellsworth presentation because I invited a bunch of scholars and she said, no, 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 no. White women did not nurse Black babies. Oh, yes, they did. Okay. And it was because of Cotton Mather. And that's a whole other piece of this story, and I may not be able to get into it. I trust that the story is relatively accurate, that Pomp was purchased for £5 sterling. I will never be able to prove that. But I can prove that he was baptized in the South Parish Church in Andover, Massachusetts. And he was identified as servant, which is a euphemism for slave. He was 3 years old. He was baptized as a servant. But Pomp now becomes the oldest and only Black child of 11 children in the Russell family. And you will see that he is connected to his brothers and sisters. He was known by them, their spouses, and the many nieces and nephews for nearly 80 years. Now, this is a process. I thought I brought a fan chart with me, but maybe I didn't. You know, I found I couldn't use the easy devices we have because I couldn't go back in Pomp's history. There was nothing further back. I don't know who his mother and father are. I don't know who his wife Peggy's mother and father are. So I couldn't do genealogy in the regular way. So Pam Beveridge said to me, Judy, I need to know how you did this. So remembering April 2021, I'm only a couple of months into this project. I had so many questions and so much information emerging in the tiniest of odd nuggets that I found I needed to categorize and web it and to make sense. And you can see that I color coded it. I know you can't read that. I can't read it anymore without a magnifying glass. But because I could, as I built the web, I could blow it up and add. Now what I can tell you is there is depth to the circles on this web. Pomp Russell's personal story has led to finding families growing over generations from enslaving other human beings to becoming truly brothers and staunch abolitionists. By doing this web, it allowed me to then whittle it down to this. Finding Pomp Russell from 2 stories, and the 2 stories are the Anti-Slavery Societies and Sally's family story. Then I kept my focus on Weld and Farmington. But then what I really needed to acknowledge is I was really working across 3 states, 4 churches, and I should say probably about 4 major education institutions, but I haven't added that to here. It starts in Massachusetts in the mid-1640s with the founding of Andover. And does anybody have any Andover genealogy? I have. To the 1760s, and that's the first 4 generations. Then it moves to New Hampshire from the 1760s to the 1800s through generations 5 and 6 in Wilton, Amherst, and a town that is now called Nelson. It was called Packersfield, New Hampshire. And those towns in New Hampshire are just above the border of Massachusetts. Okay, and you'll see a map, so it'll make sense. And then Maine, generations 5, 6, and 7 in Weld and Farmington. However, I had to acknowledge that it goes out to Hollowell, to the Hollowell proprietors. and to Brunswick because of the Bowdoin connections, and there are lots of Bowdoin connections. Which would be a whole separate PowerPoint that I haven't done yet. And these are the names. There are 5 key families, and it is so weird that all of these families are totally tied together in this story across Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. The Russells, the Hopes, the Abbotts, the Titcombs, and the Perkinses. And then there's a baker's dozen of other related names, and some of them you may recognize: Kittredge, Bass, Rogers, Houghton, Davis, Phillips, Weld, Lovejoy, Livermore, and Hamlin. And indeed, that is Hannibal Hamlin, Lincoln's vice president. And did you know Hannibal Hamlin had a cousin named Hannibal Hamlin? He did. Their fathers were twins, and they both left the name Hannibal.
Oh my gosh.
All right, but the cool thing is both Hannibals, when I finally do the abolitionist PowerPoint, which isn't done, but it's on my wall at home. Hannibal Hamlin, the cousin who was not the president. This is so cool. I couldn't believe it. He worked for the US Treasury. I'm sure his brother got him a job. But the cool thing is, he started the precursor to the Freedmen's Bureau in DC, and there is a marker on his grave acknowledging that he helped the early Black freed people find their families, which just gives me the chills. I think that's so cool. And Livermore, I mean, Livermore Falls, okay. What's that estate up there? The Washburns, they're connected to the Washburns up there. But Lovejoy, Elijah Lovejoy, Colby gives an award every year for First Amendment, the most stellar journalists that they could possibly recognize. It's connected to Elijah Lovejoy and his brother Owen. The story has just kind of gone nuts. Okay, so I'll grind you quickly. Andover to Wilton, New Hampshire, to Weld, Maine. That's a long ways away. Okay, this is a 1755 map from the New York Public Library, and it's one of my favorite maps. It depicts the most inhabited parts of New England. All right, and it's helpful because here is the Massachusetts border. This is the Merrimack River. Okay. This, by the way, is the Connecticut River, and you will notice Vermont doesn't exist, by the way. We're not. And Weld is far above this, and you will see there's no settling up there. No European settlers have made it to that point. But people settled along the waterways. And when I tell Margaret Cutt's story, Pomp's wife, which is a whole different thing, I end up over here in Portsmouth and Kittery. Okay, but I had help as I started to do my research. And it was from Dr. Lafayette Perkins, the first doctor in Weld. And mind you, he is the husband of Dorcas Abbott. Hold on to that Abbott name. Okay. And he wasn't the first town clerk in Weld, but there were a few before him who had it every couple of years. But he held it for 19 years, and bless his heart, he had great handwriting. They eventually moved to Farmington, and there's a big cemetery in Farmington, and they're buried there. And if any of you belong to the Maine Old Cemetery Association, which I do, I really need to get over there with some D2 and clean them up. All right. Dr. Perkins started a book that really focused on the families. And I found this page when he interviewed Pomp and Peggy, and he listed Pomp and Peggy and Peter and Zadok, their two sons, and Peter's Zadok's death. And I included this slide, this snapshot, to have it make sense for my friend Sally Bass. Because this is the intention to marry of Mr. Seth and Mr. Seth Bass of Wilton and Miss Nancy Russell of this town. Well, okay, so I knew genealogies were needed. It was the height of the pandemic. I called, I don't know if you know the Mineers. I called Meredith Mineer, an old friend with whom I've done a lot of traveling. And she says, oh, you've got to talk to Seth, to Sean, her son, because he's the town historian in effect, and Nancy Stoll. And I also started, and they didn't know me from Adam. Okay, so, you know, you reach out to people and it takes them a while to figure out whether they can trust you or if you're crazy. Okay, so I slowly worked my way in that way. But in the meantime, I started scouring the internet for Massachusetts genealogies related to the families that I had found in that Weld generation. Okay, that Weld Farmington generation, the Abbotts, the Titcombs, the Russells, that group, the Holts. All my searches led me back to Andover, Mass, starting in the 1640s. It was just fluky that they did. It was so odd that you would find all of these people connected to the very beginnings of Andover, and I really started puzzling over that. And by the way, I have 12 notebooks. Never mind what's on my computer. I've given up. I can't find stuff in my notebooks anymore because I have too much. All right. Well, I decided the thing to do was to go back and see if I could find any of those early maps where they identified who lived where and what neighborhood. Well, Andover's a gem because it's the witch trials. Okay, this is a 1692 map of Andover. If you have this on your computer, you could blow it up. It's on a slide, so I can't expand it for you. But I'm seeing the Abbotts, Holts, Lovejoys, Fosters, and Russells. Okay, I'm seeing all the people. And you will note Abbott with 1 T and Abbott with 2 T's. The original Abbott with 1 T was named George, and the original Abbott with 2 T's was named George. The Abbott and they all intermarried. I can't even tell you how complex those genealogies are, but they all live right in the same area. And then I noticed, I did some more reading, and you'll see Bill Ricka is right here. Now, this is 1692. What happens is Andover says, yeah, we can give up a little land and we'll create Bill Ricka. All right. The Mastermans and the Kittredges are in Bill Ricka. Kittredge, Nathaniel Kittredge, was the first resident of Weld, the first settler to come to Weld, right down at the head of the lake. Okay, I'm so glad somebody knows what these people know, have the bearings around Weld. And you'll remember Pomp is buried in the Masterman Webster Cemetery. Okay. By the way, I'll show you these two. This is just a reprint of the Andover genealogy and history, which is just fabulous because it's written by a woman, and so you have stories in it that are really timely and have some validity. This is a scholar I had no idea who I was connecting with, and this is a process. How I did this comment. I already was on an endless number of genealogical blogs, and because a lot of my ancestry comes from Massachusetts, it's right up there. People are really into it. And so I started sharing probably within the first 4 months a paragraph to entice people, because I thought maybe I'll find an ancestor, maybe I'll find somebody who's done some work on this. And I concluded it is always worth sharing, because I have scholars who are really interested in this. And one of them is this guy named Ed Bell. Andover has been willing to reckon with enslavement. And partly, I think, because Andover is also in the position of being a very well-educated community. And partly because they know the abolitionist history, because Harriet Beecher Stowe ended up down there with Cal. Okay. And Ed Bell did this book a year or so ago and sent it to me. The Persistence of Memories of Slavery and Emancipation in Historic Andover. It's not a book that you read. It's all documentation. It's nothing but documentation. And this guy is writing back and forth to me because he's really interested. This is his background. I have no idea who I was communicating with. He's the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer at the Massachusetts Historical Commission. And I'm like, oh, and he likes the story. He really likes the story. Anyway. Okay. This is a rabbit hole I will go down, and then I promise I will try not to do but one more. Okay, so I'm going to ground you in Pomp again. I believe Pomp was, unlike what is written out there, that he was born in 1765. He was actually baptized as a 3-year-old at that point. I believe he was born in 1761, and he was likely bought around the Charlestown, Boston area. We do know when he is baptized, and it is written as Pompey, servant to Thomas Russell, and you can see that right there. Then I know that for the next 9 years, Pomp is growing up as the oldest child and servant in the Thomas and Bethia Russell home in Andover. And during that time, other children are born: Bethia, Thomas Jr., Hannah, and Daniel. And the reason I've highlighted Thomas Jr. and Hannah is because they end up in Weld. All right, but now I want to, this is the rabbit hole. Yeah, this is such a rabbit hole. Okay. Andover was built on a hill. And the first parish church is up on the hill. And in fact, the second or third minister is my Francis Dane. All right. People are moving, settling down on the lower part of Andover. And so they don't want to have to keep going up the hill. And so they petition the powers that be. Well, the powers that be, there's no separation between church and state yet. It's Cotton Mather. You know, it's that crew of men. And they say, we want a church down below. Cotton Mather says, yes. They start building a church. In 1711, a church is built. This picture is the earliest I could find. It's actually the third iteration of that church. I don't know what the original one looked like, but they need a minister. They hire a 21-year-old right out of Harvard, and his name is Samuel Phillips, the Reverend Samuel Phillips. Samuel Phillips is the 4th generation His father was a goldsmith. This family had a lot of money. In fact, every one of the families I'm talking about are some of the wealthiest people in Andover. Okay, I come to find out. And they pretty much all by second or third generation have someone enslaved in their family, at least. And this is probably why I really do this research. I keep looking to expose my own ignorance. Because what did they give him for compensation but his own enslaved man? And Cotton Mather had one after all, and that's what they did back then. Who knew? I didn't. Okay, well, here's the Phillips story, and I'm telling it to you now because as I go along, it'll help you. It'll make more sense with the story. He's fourth generation. His name is Samuel Phillips. Okay, and he is there forever. He is the person who would have baptized Pomp, but he would have also baptized Bethia, the mother, and Thomas, the father. Okay, because he was there from 1711 on. Sam Phillips has a son, Sam Jr. Sam Jr. starts Phillips Andover. Okay. Well, because they own their theological belief system, they portion off a part of that land to become Andover Theological Seminary, which then became Andover Newton. Okay. Well, Sam Jr. gets a little help from his brother John, starting Phillips Andover. And then John moves to Exeter and he starts Phillips Exeter. Okay, I'm going, oh, this is just way too wild. Then there's a third son, William. William says, oh, my brother has education. Totally sewn up. Okay, not a problem at all. He says, I want to be a merchant anyhow. Now remember, his family has money. Okay, I want to be a merchant. I'm going to go into Boston. Well, then I find him, because it's the beginning of the Revolution, I find him as one of the handful of selectmen, along with John Hancock and Sam Adams. Okay, I even find a letter that they've written to Benjamin Franklin concerned about the Boston Massacre, because Franklin is over in France at that time. Okay, so it goes a little bit further and it'll make sense in a moment. William is so good at what he does, now mind you, it's the Revolution, that they make him the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. William has a son named Jonathan Phillips, and it's Jonathan Phillips who buys up this whole massive piece of land that encompasses far more than well. And I think I found the case of insider trading. You know, it's just so wild. All right, but I had to start it with knowing that Jonathan Phillips owned wealth. I didn't even know it was that massive piece of land. And I had to do his lineage back. All right. The way I did genealogies is totally unconventional. And in this case, I really had to start with, here's my purse. I had to start with Thomas and Bethia Russell, who had all these kids. I took Thomas's line back, and every genealogy that I did became a working document that I had to really keep playing with for it to make sense. So yes, Bethia lost her firstborn, named after her. And that's when they got Pomp. Then it went down through, and every name that I eventually highlighted in yellow ended up in Weld, Maine. And even one that I didn't know when I had, let me get my cursor again. So it's Hannah Phoebe, who married a Barrett, and Barretts are still there. Abel, Joseph, Ephraim, and their sister who never married, Asna. Okay, Hillsborough County, you go over the Merrimack River. We are now in Wilton, New Hampshire. That's where it is. Okay, look. Temple, New Sharon, if you know town names in Franklin County. Okay. I couldn't find a really early map of, well, this is the earliest map they actually have. I contacted the president of the Wilton Historical Society. And again, it's one of those maps where it lays out the names of the families in all those clusters. Again, it's Abbott's, Holt's, Lovejoy's, Russell's. Okay, and I did find that not only had Bethia and Thomas taken Pomp and siblings, but Bethia's cousin, Timothy Holt, came to Wilton, New Hampshire. So these are parents, these are adults, all of the same generation. And he had enslaved a boy named Titus. And Wilton Historical Society had no idea of the names of these young Black boys that lived in their community. But what I found out is all of these families went to Reverend Samuel Phillips South Parish Church. And because Massachusetts kept amazing records, I found the records of that South Parish Church when it started. It literally identifies the very first person who joined the church, the date they joined, the date they left, and why they left. And in the whys as to leaving, it was to settle Wilton, New Hampshire. So what happened is your fourth and fifth generation in, Thomas Russell is fourth, Bethia's fifth. The Holts were incredibly welcome. The fathers are not willing to give up land in Andover. Yeah, their firstborn son gets a pile of land. They don't even give it to them until they're in their late 20s, early 30s, and they don't give them a lot of it. Okay, so by this fourth and fifth generation, they know not only is Andover getting crowded from their vantage point, they know to move. And they move. Wilton is a day's horse ride away from Andover. It's only 40 miles. And you can just get on your horse and go. And you're just going over the Merrimack River. There's a way to get over. And you always go back. And one of the things that I haven't put in this slideshow is that I have started looking at the names of the enslaved people who lived while Pomp was growing up there and a little bit beyond. There are some remarkable names associated with it. We have a postage stamp for Salem Poor. He was a young Black soldier from Andover who was at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Okay, and there are children's books about Salem Poor. Okay, then I come across this book, and it rescues me. It's a good thing people have their special interests. It is called Strong and Brave Fellows, New Hampshire's Black Soldiers and Sailors in the American Revolution. And I find Pomp Russell in here, except he has him in Wells, Maine, not Weld, Maine. So I've talked to him about that. Pomp, the Russell family moved about 1770 over to Wilton, New Hampshire. But from the time of Pomp's birth until the time he's just about 16, we don't know. What is he doing? We know the family is successful. Okay, but we have no idea what he's doing, except that he was baptized when he was 3. But suddenly, I have real information. In 1777, 16-year-old Pomp Russell enlists, and he enlists under New Hampshire General John Stark, and he serves at the Battle of Bennington. And this becomes another rabbit hole to go down, because everybody had him placed at Bunker Hill, and he couldn't possibly have been at Bunker Hill. But because we have good records, I found Pomp Russell's records. All right, he was in Moses Nichols' regiment under, I think, a Sergeant Goss. And this is his payroll, one of his payroll slips. So what I know is it's 1777. And it's the Battle of Bennington, and I am not a historian. And to be perfectly honest, I hated history in high school. I absolutely hated it. It was war, it was dates, it was men, and you had no stories. But I found myself intrigued because what I learned in reading is that the Battle of Bennington was part of the Saratoga campaign, and this battle was considered the turning point in the Revolution. What was happening is the British and the Iroquois were coming down. They were doing us in. Okay. Vermont is not a state. It's still province of New Hampshire. Okay. And somebody sends a letter over to Governor John Langdon. Okay, over in Portsmouth, and says, if you ever want any of this land, you better get over here right away and help. Langdon immediately sends a message to General Stark. And he says, you have complete control. None of Washington's other generals can influence you at all. You have complete control, but get as many people signed up and get them over to Bennington as fast as you can. In 3 days' time, in a piece of research that I read, so instead of, there are competing stories, every state thinks it did it super well, and the other states weren't as much help. But I found this study, and it said, in 3 days' time, those riders signed up over 2,500 soldiers, and Pomp was one of them. And what I now know, because of his military papers, those riders, that rider who landed in Wilton, New Hampshire to sign people up, well, he arrived there July 20th, because that's when Pomp signed up. All right. And what happened is, after they signed up, they marched them very quickly up. So Hillsborough County is here, and I showed you where Wilton, New Hampshire was. They just took them up to the border, to a New Hampshire border, to Fort Number 4, which is still an active museum. And they, in Charlestown, New Hampshire, they crossed over the Connecticut River and they marched him down to Bennington. And when I told my book group, now mind you, I'm in Montpelier, I told them they marched him down to Bennington. They're going, they were fighting with Ethan Allen and those Green Mountain Boys. And I mean, it was, can't you just, it was really kind of cool. I'm kind of crazy. Am I driving you nuts? Is this okay? Okay. The DAR, almost 200 years later, in 1976, actually put a marker up on Pomp's grave. And we have to thank the DAR. They have a document that is online and readily accessible. They decided to find as many Black and Indigenous soldiers as they could possibly find. And they organized it by state and they identified their sources. It's a fabulous document. And so the local DAR knew, Pomp was buried up in the Masterman Webster Cemetery under a New Hampshire Revolutionary War stone. So you're 16 years old. You marched, you fought, and it was not a nice life. You come back home. The terms of enlistment are really short. The time periods, they just were. Okay, unless you were a full-time soldier and always soldiering. Pomp's still 16 when he returns home. What does he do for the next 3 years? We don't know a thing. Did he work for his father in the mill? His father and another cousin started a big starch company, which became a really big deal. Okay, was he sent out to learn a trade? Did he learn a trade when he was 16 and older, or did they apprentice him at 12? I don't know. In the early Maine Historical Register, it says that Pomp was freed by his father when he turned 21. He was 16 and had been in battle. I work with a woman, Adelaide Solomon Jordan, a Black woman who is in her 80s and found Pomp 15 years ago and did a thesis on him. And she said, Judy, you have to know, if it was possible, they walked away. If it was remotely possible, they walked away. So while he could have been freed by his father, he could have walked away. We just don't know. And we don't know if his father treated him like a son, because he's still listed as servant. And all the messaging around Weld in the early history is that he's free only when he turned 21. Now, mind you, he's still in New Hampshire. Okay. This is the cool thing. Have no picture. I could show you a handwritten marriage certificate, but it's not the original one. It's the ones that the state started writing to copy over. Okay, if I ever find the original, I'll post it. In 1778, Pomp marries a woman named Margaret Peggy. And Pomp is 27. I am assuming, and have no proof, that Peggy was probably about the same age. And they got married in Amherst, New Hampshire. Amherst is a town just a little east of Wilton. Okay, look who he's married by. His justice of the peace, Dr. Moses Nichols, his commander, who is then Brigadier General Moses Nichols. I find that just beyond charming, that they had to have a connection. It's 1789 to 1804. He's in Packersfield with his family. They have their first home. In December, they have their firstborn son in 89, Peter. But then there is that marvelous 1790 census, because we have Pomp. He's the head of the household, total of 3. And you know, the language in that census is he's listed as other. That means not free white or slave, which means the 3 of them were free blacks. This is the background of this slide is a stellar full project. Remember when I said, share your information, connect with people? Well, I connected with a man named Rich Church, who is a Nelson, New Hampshire historian. And Rich went, wow, this is really cool. Let's see if I can help. He finds a document over there where, and he identifies that Pomp and Peggy owned a house. They had 30 acres. And they had livestock, and I didn't list out the livestock, but they had a horse, they had a couple of cows, they had livestock to take care of their family. And they lived with their 2 sons for 15 years. And you know how I know it? He paid taxes. Okay, and if you had a house at that time, it had to be a house that was taxable. In the early Weld records, there were people who had houses, but they weren't good enough houses to yet be taxable. So this says to me clearly that Pomp had created a home for his family. And I knew he was a farmer. Rich continues to drive me nuts, saying he must have done something else. He had to do something else. And Judy, keep in mind, 30 acres isn't a lot of land. It's not a quarter section. Oh, it's 160 acres. Okay. But he had 30 acres and he's a free man. All right. And then I get an email from this person in Ontario, Canada, who says, why are you doing this research on Pomp Russell? Because I've got a connection. All right. That's another whole story that I won't tell you yet. But the guy's name is Billy Richardson, and we write back and forth. And now I have to tell you this thing. Pomp and Peggy have a son, Peter. Peter gets married to a woman who is a widow. Her name is Prudence Davis. Prudence brings 5 children to the family. And they eventually have a son, but that's as far as I can go genealogically with the true Pomp Russell family. But their oldest son, when his father dies, their oldest son, Prudence and her husband, oldest son, farms himself up. Because that's what you do as a boy. Okay, and he's taken in. He eventually, wait till I tell you the abolitionist end of the story, maybe a year or 2 from now. That boy eventually becomes a well-known, well-spoken Canadian Black abolitionist. Because Prudence's husband was Black. Prudence was a Wampanoag from Gayton. Anyway, Billy, when he wrote me, he said, well, I have Samuel Henry Davis Jr.'s memoir that he wrote for his kids. And he said, both Pomp and Peter were blacksmiths. So they had a trade. All right. But here's the thing that Rich Church told me that just still, I went around for days saying, and Peggy sang in the choir. Peggy sang in the choir. She's a Black woman in an all-white town. And she's up front in the choir. Which also says she can read. So now I'm into Weld. Recognize that lake from, this is Webb Pond from looking from State Park out to Mount Blue. All right, here's the Jacob Abbott map. And this is a snapshot of it. You'll get a bigger picture in a minute. In 1794, this map was marked off by a man named Bullen, who was one of the few state surveyors. All right. Those of you who have read Laura Thatchell Ulrich's book, The Midwife Tale, is she found the diary of Martha Ballard. Martha Ballard's from Andover, man. Okay. And she is a midwife between Hollowell and Augusta, that whole territory, in exactly the same time period I'm working on. Okay. And Bullen is in this book because they're all related. All right. So Bullen marks off this map. And Jacob Abbott says, oh, sure, I'll sell the properties. Who is he selling the properties for? But Jonathan Phillips. Okay. Insider trading deal. Okay. What I want you to see on this map is this right here. Do you see this road right here? This is called the Great Coos Road. I'm from New Hampshire. I call it the Great Coos County, you know? But you don't say it that way in the well, I guarantee you. Well, what happened is the Hollowell proprietors, as I started digging into this, it wasn't making a whole lot of sense. The Hollowell proprietors are part of the Plymouth colony. They've come up to Hollowell. Have any of you been to Hollowell? Yeah, okay. You know, right along the Kennebec, right in the center of Old Hollowell, are all these cool old buildings that were not only stores, they were storage sheds for the ships. Well, what happened is the Hollowell proprietors were merchants. They knew if they could get their ships up from Boston and get them into the Kennebec was wide and deep and still. And so their schooners could make it all the way up to Hollowell. Well, now you've got the goods in Hollowell and you want to sell them. And you want to sell them inland. So they said to Jacob Abbott, who was very entrepreneurial. By the way, this is Jacob Abbott I, who was also a trustee of Phillips Andover. Okay. They say to Jacob Abbott I, if you will build a road, meaning a dirt path for a horse to travel, essentially, we want it to go this way, and we want you to make it all the way over to the Connecticut River. And if you do it, we'll give you plantation number 6. We'll just give you the land. Well, evidently there was a court case because it took a whole lot longer to build that path than he thought. But the Great Coos Road was a really big deal for the Hollowell proprietors. All right. You see Webb Pond. And you see where I highlighted this? This is Pomp Russell's property. These squares are approximately 160 acres apiece. An old timer told me that they're called quarter sections. That I trust he was right. Okay, because he actually lives on one of the Russell quarter sections, and his is 145 acres. And you will see his house shortly. When Jonathan Phillips he didn't need any more money. He let Jacob Abbott and a man named Benjamin Abbott buy up the rest of the land from him so they could continue to sell it. Well, the reality is, if you got a quarter acre, you had to settle it. You had to really build a house. You had to clear the land. You had to build a house, or you weren't going to really keep that land, is what I've been told. Okay. Well, who do you invite? Jacob Abbott is over in Wilton, New Hampshire. He invites family and friends. Okay, and you'll see them in a genealogy slide in a second. But remember, Jonathan Abbott has the land, then he sells it to Jacob and Benjamin Weld. I think Benjamin Weld had a whole lot more money than Jacob Abbott did, but they were together on it. All right. I stumble across this book, The Rich Men of Massachusetts. It is an annual. Okay, note, I've already told you Jonathan Phillips' family story. Jonathan Phillips in 1851 was worth $1 million. He was a big deal in Massachusetts. Now, I did the math. Phillips' wealth of $1 million in 1851 equals $37,480,000 in today's money. And then there's, I don't know if the next slide is Abbott or Weld. It's Weld. I stumble across this. I tell you, I've gone down more rabbit holes than you can possibly imagine. See that picture of the house? That at the time was the largest house in Boston. The largest house. It is owned in 1793, the year Weld is kind of coming into, the land is being plotted out. It's owned by a young Benjamin Weld. And I'm going, where did Benjamin Weld get his money? Okay, now you do know that there's a Weld governor, that it actually does connect to that line. Okay, but this is what it says. He was the longtime deputy collector of customs for the city of Boston. The Long Wharf is already built. The Long Wharf, I find out, is almost a half mile long out into Boston Harbor. Never mind the little Hancock Wharf and the other wharfs. Okay. Benjamin Weld is collecting all that money. And who is Benjamin Weld's wife? Abigail Perkins. Dr. Lafayette Perkins' older sister. Okay. Lafayette Perkins was in the military. His father, actually, William Perkins, there's an island out in Boston Harbor. I don't remember the name of it, but this island, it had a fort on it, and he was in charge of that fort. Okay. Anyhow, it's pretty clear how Lafayette Perkins gets to Weld. Benjamin Weld owns the land. He's married to Lafayette's older sister. They need a doctor in Weld. Now here's Jacob Abbott, and the portrait in back is Jacob Abbott II, and the man sitting on the sofa is Jacob Abbott III. Jacob Abbott II was the first Abbott to live in Weld. Jacob Abbott I sold up all that land, but he was a generation older than the people who settled it. Jacob Abbott II lived exactly where you two know, right at the head of the lake. Okay, and he called it Lee Meadows. And he started a school there called Lee Meadows Academy. And you'll see a slide in a second that speaks to then the new school, another school he created in Weld. The man in front is Jacob Abbott III. Jacob Abbott III started Abbott School. Abbott School brought students from Central America, from South America, as well as from the US. And a lot of those people ended up settling in Farmington. And you will see names like the Abagoans and others that initially their first generation showed up because of the Abbott School. I told you that the Abbotts not only were involved in Phillips Andover, but they started a female academy in Andover. And by Jacob Abbott III and then his son, they create Abbott School. This is what school looked like. That's the Abbott property as you come in, swing into town, into Farmington. You go past the McDonald's and the Giffords, and you swing into town, and it's where the university is. There's a little pond there. This was a park created by their students, 10 acres. And the bridges are designed to represent bridges in history. There, and the back hillside was shaped to look like Mount Blue. And they called it Little Blue. They even had a gondola. I couldn't believe that one. Okay, so it's 1805. Pomp Russell family moves to Weld. All we know is that Abel and Joseph, according to Jura Foster, who wrote that, the couple of Maine Genealogical, I can't remember the name of the journal, the Early Register.
Amazing.
Yeah. Abel and Joseph invited Pomp to settle at the foot of Hurricane Mountain. That's the top of Center Hill. That's what's in back of Center Hill. And we know that's where he settled. They say they bought land, it is told that they bought land from him and built a house. We have no proof of that. But because of a new conversation I had literally about a week and a half ago with a Russell descendant, I would suggest to you that their older sister, Hannah, had a hand in inviting them. Hannah Russell Houghton was Pomp's sister and Peggy's sister-in-law. And I found out she lived in Dublin, New Hampshire, which was only 8 miles up to Packersfield. That was nothing for people to travel. And thanks to Laura Ulrich, Ulrich's book, she talked about the invisible women's economy. The reality is, we know about the men out there farming, but we don't take into consideration who birthed the children. Okay, who washed the bodies, who prepared the food and preserved the food, who sewed the clothes, who did that, all of that stuff. And they did it together as they were socializing. All right. Hannah is the only close relative when Pomp and Peggy are spending their 15 years in Packersfield. So she could have easily said to Peggy, we're moving next year. Year after is when Pomp and Peggy came. So she could have hit her brothers up and said, if we're moving, you need to get Pomp and Peggy, because they would have been very close in age. This is the Abel Russell house up on Center Hill. Pomp was born in 1761. He would have been 44 years old when he moved to Weld. The Abel Russell is my friend Sally's great-great-great-grandfather. He married a woman named Nancy Clemens, and they had a daughter named Nancy. That's how the Bass family came into this. But Abel and Joseph were both much younger than Pomp. They were 27 and 25. And Abel and Joseph lived side by side, and Pomp and Peggy lived nearby. And I know that because of the next document I'm going to show you. They, along with their sons, Peter and Zadok, would have spent family time in each other's houses, along with their many aunts, uncles, and cousins. Abel and Nancy had a son, Joseph. And in the Maine Historical Society, they have this book of memorandum. And it says, my father in 1802, my father, Abel Russell, came to this place, number 5, or Webb Pond Plantation, from Wilton, New Hampshire, in June, bought his land from Jacob Abbott. That would have been Jacob Abbott 1. From Concord, New Hampshire. I told you Jacob Abbott got around. He was just everywhere. It jumps down to 1803. The first clearing was made for this farm in June. In 1804, the old barn built this year, the first framed barn in town. And wheat was sowed that first winter, okay, that first year, for the first time. This was found by the prior owners. I took that descendant who told me about Hannah Russell Houghton living in Dublin. I took him to the house the other day, and he met the man, the 85-year-old who lives there now, who happens to care about history, and listening to the two of them talk. This is Nancy Russell, who married Seth Bass. Okay, I had to do the Bass genealogy. You don't have to read it. I don't really have to talk about it, other than to say, once again, it started out tidy. And it got as messy as all get out, but I can read it. And everything that is highlighted, every name that is highlighted, ended up being people who ended up living in wealth. And I did the same thing with Pomp's siblings who settled in wealth. Thomas, Hannah, Phoebe, Abel, Joseph, Ephraim, and sister Asenath. And then I thought, well, sure, I'll put down the wife's name because that's going to be helpful to me. These are the names: Abbott, Houghton, Clements, Dascombe, Ireland, and Asenath never got married. And then I thought, well, I can add siblings. I mean, I can add children to this mess because it's a working document. Okay, do you ever do anything this messy? Oh,
Yes.
Messier.
well, it translated into this. No, wait a minute. It'll translate into the next slide. I got to the Abbotts, and remember I told you the Abbotts are a total pain? Once I sorted them all through, I could make it quite simple. George Abbott with 2 T's and George Abbott with 1 T. And I could see how they were married. And then I could get over here and look, this is it. Here's Jacob Abbott 1 and Lydia Stevens. And I find that Jacob and Lydia have a Phoebe, Jacob Abbott 2, Lydia, who ends up marrying Thomas Russell. And that allows me to create a simple slide. And the slide is this clear. Thomas Jr. married Lydia. You already know they're all from Andover. They've all moved to Weld. I mean, their parents stayed in Andover, but 7 of the 11 moved to Weld. And this is how I connected to the Anti-Slavery Society. Finally, you thought I'd never go back there. Lydia's parents are Jacob Abbott 1 and Lydia. Lydia's brother is Jacob Abbott 2. Jacob Abbott 2 was the secretary of the Weld and Slavery Society. Lydia's sister Phoebe married a Benjamin Abbott with 2 T's. And they had what I thought were 2 daughters tied up with this story. Phoebe, because she married John Titcomb. And John Titcomb, you remember, was the secretary of the Farmington Anti-Slavery Society. And they had a daughter named Dorcas, who married Dr. Lafayette Perkins. He was the president of the Weld Anti-Slavery Society. And I tacked down here the guy to remind myself, Dr. Lafayette Perkins' sister, Nabby Abigail, married Benjamin Weld, from Welder's name. I missed a sister. The sister I missed was Abigail. And I only found her about a week and a half ago. Abigail married Hannibal Hamlin of the US Treasury and the DC founder of the DC Freedmen's Bureau. So now we've got a federal connection with opposition to slavery. We've got the Massachusetts connection to that through the Perkinses and Abbotts. And these people continued to read and make sure all their children were educated, including their daughters. And Wilton and Farmington are about 20 miles apart. Those sisters would have made sure that families were getting together on an absolutely regular basis. It truly, from everything I've read, it was nothing to hop on your horse and to go 20 miles because you didn't have television. You know, you hung out with your family, and your family in this case was a phenomenally well-educated family. I mentioned Jacob Abbott and education. If I could blow up this fabulous document that I went to the Special Collections Library in Bowdoin last week. This is the Benvenue Female High School in Weld. This is a catalog. And it indicates that the two teachers are Jacob Abbott's daughters, Jacob Abbott II's daughters. And if you could read these names, these are all the names I told you, and the earliest of Weld residents. And these are all girls, but look, they let in boys. And there are Stoles, by the way, on that list. And he petitioned the legislature, the Maine legislature, to create this school for the purpose of advancing the interest of literature and science, of promoting morals and piety, and a more general diffusion of the benefits of education among children and youth in the humble walks of life. And best of all, there's this map that allows you, we're into Weld, and I'm almost done, I promise I'm almost done. This is where the Masterman and Webster lands are. The Kittredges, the areas, you know, where the Kittredges at the head of the lake, the Abbotts, that's right there. This is where all the Russell lands are: Abel, Joseph, Ephraim, Pomps, and Peters. That is Peters' land on that map where that arrow is. Pomps' land. It says this was a working map for Jacob Abbott, and that says Pomp Russell. And because I had all those other families, I had to figure out where they were, and so I did a cut and paste and blew up the pictures so I could read them. The Russells are all here, though these lands are not labeled Russell, except for Pomp. If you go up Center Hill, you'll see there's a schoolhouse as you turn the corner, and then you just keep going and you'll see two capes. But there were the Holtons who married a Russell. There's Lafayette Perkins land, and that's where the big old inn is, the big white inn. You know where I mean? You come from Wilton and you're headed on that side of the lake. There's a big old white inn. Sean told me the other day that was Lafayette Perkins property. And it's very close to the lake, so we would have been on the lake, I assume. And there are Holtons, and here are all the Basses. 1813 tax record. And they're all hand sewn. They've never been copied before. I badgered Sean. I badgered him. I bought a massive scanner, and I said, you have to let me use it, because they hadn't copied any of these records yet. And I'm not even a quarter of the way through. But these lovely hand-sewn documents. Across the top, the name of the person, the poll, if they paid poll tax, if they had a house substantial enough so it could be taxed and recorded, if they had a barn, if they had an outhouse, and I don't think an outhouse is for what we describe as an outhouse, it would be an outbuilding. And then it goes on to list unimproved and improved and unimproved land, and then it identifies literally if it's a yearling horse or if it's an older horse, it's all kinds of detail. But all I want you to pay attention to is Abel, Joseph, Ephraim, Pomp, and his son Peter are right here. Joseph has the only house that is taxed in 1813. They all have farms. Remember, Pomp arrived when he was 44 years old. I think Peter and Pomp shared a quarter section when you look at the amount of land totaled up here by them. And Pomp had already cleared 20 acres. And by the time Peter was 24, he had cleared 4 of his own. And they had several unimproved acres. And this is just a close-up. You can see Abel, Joseph, Ephraim, Pomp, and Peter. Nancy Stoll helped me by taking your current tax map and overlaying the old map. And she suggests that in listening to a state archaeologist, this may be where Peter's property was. We're still struggling with that, and I'm working with I don't know what to call him. He's the guy who heads the state park. Really nice guy. Okay, only descendants for Pomp and Peggy are Zadok, who died early, Peter, who finally married Prudence Davis, and they had a son, Zadok, who was in the 1850 census in Weld. Here is a picture on Center Hill using Google Earth. There's Joseph Russell's house. You've come around that corner in Center Hill. And you've gone, well, maybe half a mile, maybe more, and there are two capes. Joseph's, and this is Abel's with a big barn back here. And go down another couple miles, and this is the Masterman Webster Cemetery toward the Masterman Webster land. And Pomp is buried right about here. There he is. And because I belong to the Maine Old Cemetery Association, I don't know if you know, we use ground penetrating radar to detect graves. Well, you know what is equally good? Dowsing rods. And I happen to douse. And Adelaide, my Black friend who did the early work on Pomp, said, Judy, there's no story like this story. These are ordinary people. We need these stories. But we don't know where Peggy is. I went up and doused. She's right beside him. And there's nothing further on either side. She lies right about here.
Well, considering that's a replacement stone, there probably was never a stone there.
There
even
had
if
to
it was-
be something there, because everyone has, I found a 1916 article about the Russells, written by a Russell. Talk, and midway through, he said, and the black side, and let me tell you about the black side of our family. Okay, because they considered Pomp part of their family. All right, and that stone was already there.
But I mean,
Okay,
okay, a stone,
This
not
stone,
that one.
not, no, well, I found a military card that indicates that the stone was ordered. No name on it, have no idea who ordered it, no date on it. I can't find out when it was placed. I did check with the DAR, they did not place that stone.
No, that looks like the military stones that you get from the military if you go and ask for one.
That's a 20th century stone.
Yeah, I would say that that's. When did he die?
He died in about 1838.
So I'm thinking that stone was put up there 50 years later anyway.
Yeah,
But there might have been a rock or something so that somebody knew it was there.
somehow the Mastermans and Websters, in fact, one of the, I could have told you this accurately probably 2 days ago. Well, either one of the Mastermans or the Websters served at the Battle of Bennington as well. They would have had a lot to talk about. And there were a handful. It wasn't like those towns where you received land when you completed your service. Okay, well, it wasn't like that. This was a cluster of people who just came together. I don't have any idea.
Yeah, I'm guessing. I mean, he might have had a wooden cross that was, or a wooden stone that was replaced or whatever.
Yeah,
Because somebody clearly must have known where it was,
exactly.
not, they're not just kind of guessing that he's buried in this cemetery.
Yeah, I really don't. That's true.
know that.
What?
It's two people in there. You figured that out. But that's all.
Yeah.
Oh, it was so much fun to do. I usually bring my dancing rods.
Yeah. This is interesting because Fort Fairfield, which is up in Aroostook County near Presque Isle,
there's a Houghton Road and a Russell Road, and they were the earliest families to settle there. And then there's a Weld, Maine up there as well, between Trestle and Ashland. I live
Ooh,
there, so I know this.
that's intriguing.
Yeah, so they
Well,
must have.
there was also something called the Weld Club. And the Weld, all of these people who said, nah, I'm not gonna deal with this wilderness, went back to Massachusetts, and they would meet on an annual basis. And they would do, and nobody has ever pulled together all the Weld Club reports, but they are in some of the old papers scattered, you know, you get this year and then you get 5 years later. And they tell stories about how people have left. All right, and they also tell stories about what it was like back then. It's really intriguing. So I would love, I tried to Google that stone, and I couldn't figure out what window of a year it would be. If you know how to do that, I just couldn't figure out how to do it. And somebody had to petition to have a New Hampshire stone. You know, could it have been one of the masterpieces? Because, okay, so wait a minute, here is a possibility. Hannah Russell, Pomp's sister, married James Houghton. They had a son, Ephraim, and Ephraim married Sarah Sprague Masterman. All right, and they were very much connected to the Pomp Russell family. And indeed to Samuel Henry Davis's family, Peter's wife and kids. I could see somebody in the Masterman family petitioning for a stone, because there are several other stones with blacks. And they were in the Revolution. Okay, so I'll shoot this off. This is the last slide. So, from a book group in Vermont, reckoning with our white privilege and wanting a safer world for all to grow, to an 1836 abolitionist almanac, and a quietly held old family story of enslavement, family, and freedom, we found Pomp Russell, once an enslaved Black infant, now a free man living in Weld, Maine. And this is the Weld, Maine Church. Weld founders were a community, what I conclude is very different from the previous generation. Weld founders were a community of family and friends. They really were kith and kin, who chose to live, work, and worship together, and believed in educating all of their children together. These early settlers were of European and African descent. And now those 1834 anti-slavery societies make sense to me. I really think the Weld people cared about each other, and I think the difference is one generation removed, there was still the caste system. There was still a racist caste system with enormous wealth. And yet all these people came together to create a new settlement. So that's it. That's that. The story went on so long.
But it's time for cake.
Yeah, that's Adelaide, by the way, and that's Sean.
So did Pomp and Peggy they had no descendants who lived past
One.
three generations?
They had Zeta, who was still in the census in 1850.
And you can't find
But I haven't been able to find anything beyond him. I found on Ancestry a couple of families, probably 3 or 4 families that I communicated with, but they said they're white Russells and they didn't know the story. I found a Black woman who has a Russell line and looks like it will connect, and I've tried to contact her 3 times with enough of the story to absolutely intrigue her. and she hasn't been.
So where was this grandson living in the eighteen fifty?
He was living in Weld
Oh, okay.
in the 1850 census.
Do you have any evidence that Pomp was a blacksmith in Weld?
That's what we're now looking for. There are two, the people I talked with in Weld told me there were two blacksmith shops, one at each end of the lake. But I'm convinced there may have been one up on Center Hill because there was such a population of.
He came as a working blacksmith. My guess is that's where he was those missing years right after the revolution. He had to apprentice to someone to learn to be a blacksmith.
And he
Yeah.
probably did it before he was 16.
So,
Sharon?
possibly.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Or the neighbors.
You wouldn't know.